Thanks for taking the time, guys, on a holiday early morning. I really appreciate you accommodating my schedule. Thank you.
Oh yeah, no worries. Yeah, so a quick introduction. I'm Brian. I'm the one that spoke to you on the phone through email and stuff. You got Eric.
Casey. Nice to meet you. Well, we appreciate you jumping on a call and letting us do this.
Absolutely. No, it's an important topic, and obviously a lot of people are talking about it. So I'm just appreciate the chance to, kind of have a broader discussion. And honestly, I always like to talk to people that hunt and fish. So there you go.
Very good. So just getting started off, for those that are not familiar, we are joined today by Representative Casey Snider. And the main kind of objective of the conversation is just going to be trying to gain a little more clarity and insight on HB 295. Casey is the representative who introduced that recently. It certainly is created quite the storm in the state of Utah for various discussion points back and forth on what people think about the bill. So the goal is really just to try to gain a little more insight from Casey directly. Hopefully, if we have some time, go through some questions that we've kind of accumulated through a variety of feedback and what have you. And just by the end of the conversation, hopefully allow everybody to have a little bit more information, however you might be looking at the bill. There's a lot of folks that are in support. There's a lot of folks that are in opposition. And I'm sure there's equal amounts that are not sure, maybe somewhere in the middle. And, I think one of the things that we are hoping for is to learn a little bit more about kind of the background from your perspective, and then roll through some various questions that we've gotten from friends, people that follow our platform, questions that we have on our own, and just try to gain a better overall understanding of kind of what is currently happening with this bill. So I don't know exactly how much time you're willing to provide us today, but we got lots of questions.
Okay, well, I got as much as you need. I have another call in about an hour, okay. But if we need to push that off, I'm more than happy to too. I mean, this is an important topic, and I appreciate the opportunity to engage. So yeah, what do you need to do?
So I think first things first, could you give us a little bit of background on yourself? So for anybody that's listening that maybe isn't as familiar with what's happening, don't necessarily know what exactly representative means, can you provide a little insight for that?
Yeah, so just a little background on me, I think it might be helpful. So I represent in the state legislature everything on the south end of Cache Valley. So this is going into my second term here. And I have been involved in these issues my career before coming into this spot. But most importantly, I grew up, just like most of your listeners, maybe not all of them, hunting and fishing, right? This has been my passion since I was a little kid. I started when I was about 12 years old, and that's been something that's continued my whole life. And until I got in the legislature, which is sort of a 45-day part-time thing, that was my fall, was out in the field. I was elk hunting, I was duck hunting. That was what we did. The legislature puts a little more time constraints on it, but it's something I'm incredibly passionate about. And last year, I actually ran the constitutional right to hunt and fish in the state of Utah. So for those of you who aren't familiar with that piece of legislation, last year, I basically said, look, the right to hunt and fish in the state of Utah is fundamental to who we are. And I started the legislation that allowed that to move forward. I got it through the state legislature with overwhelming majorities, had to have 2/3 to even pass. And then it went to onto the ballot for people to make a decision here this last year, which over 74% of our electorate decided that was important. So hunting and fishing is important to me. It's important to the people of the state of Utah. And I think we've worked towards protecting those means as in my career and as part of who I am. The other thing I'd say is I also chair the hunting and fishing caucus in the state legislature. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that, a caucus is basically a group of legislators who care about these issues, who meet weekly during the session, and then off. It's part of the Congressional Sportsmen's group of caucuses, which is a nationwide conglomeration of state legislatures that engage on these issues. So very passionate about this, and in an elected role, based on some feedback from constituents and conversations with the Division of Wildlife Resources, have decided to have this conversation during this session.
So real quick, before we jump into like the bill itself, can you walk us through how does an idea originate and then eventually end up as a bill and then potentially into law? Again, I think one of the reasons we want to have this conversation is I think there's a group of folks in the hunting community who maybe have a little bit more experience under the belt and have been down this road and through this process over many, many years. And then there's probably a whole nother group of folks in this community who maybe they're younger, maybe they're newer into it, and they're not as familiar with like the political process and how these bills get introduced. And just from an educational standpoint, can you kind of walk us through that almost, origination of an idea into a bill in the most simplistic way you can explain it?
Sure. No, happy to. And I think I appreciate that question. I think as these issues, we're talking about my bill today, but there are going to be plenty more coming down the pipe. So, and there's not a lot of us that hunt and fish. So any knowledge about the process and how to engage, I think is going to make for a better community here. So, a bill, like anything, begins with an idea or a conversation. It occurs with either legislators or communities who then engage a legislator with a concept or an issue they'd like to see resolved. And this is not unique to hunting and fishing issues, right? Like it's traffic laws, it's crimes, it's basically anything that's regulated under state or federal statute ultimately begins with a conversation and a law or an issue that needs to be addressed. And that's how it originates. There's that engagement there that initially begins. And then if there's enough buy-in from whoever at my level wants to make that decision or that conversation become more elevated, it's then drafted as a potential statute. And that bill contains what could be law if it goes through the entire process, but it highlights what regulation or change or whatever is going to be in line. And then that is presented as an idea to other members of the legislature. So it starts in the House where I am. If it was a senator that sponsored the bill, it would start in the Senate, and it goes through committee, which is where a group of other legislators, it can be anywhere from a dozen to half a dozen. If it's in the Senate, it's half a dozen. In our legislature, committees are usually that scale. In the House, it's 14 or 15, give or take. And it's debated. That initial idea is bounced around and debated, and changes are made and discussions are had, and then a vote is taken among that body. From committee, it then goes to the floor of whatever body it was introduced. So in my instance, it's we've had a conversation in committee. Now it's going to the floor of the House of Representatives, and then the entire body gets to engage, right? So it's 70 plus members in the state of Utah's legislature who will have a discussion, offer alternatives, make suggestions or what have you. And then if it passes that with a simple majority, it then goes to a Senate committee where the same process repeats itself, where a group of senators debate the concept and have a conversation. And then after going to the Senate, it then goes to the floor of the Senate, where again, the same process repeats itself. And then it ends up at the governor, who can sign it. At every point in this process, it has to have a majority vote. And then obviously the governor doesn't represent a majority. Well, he represents the state as a majority, but he is a vote of one. And that's what he applies with his signature. And if it reaches the end of that process, it becomes law. And that's basically how every piece of legislation runs through.
Excellent. I appreciate that. I do think that's super beneficial. Again, as like a large number of folks gain more insight and interest into how these ideas turn into an eventual bill. All right, so let's get into the main topic. HB 295, again, is the bill that someone brought to you, or a group of folks brought to you, and you essentially have supported. And walk us through, kind of in your own words, what the bill represents. And you referenced the most ideas have a problem that you're trying to solve. So give us a little insight on where that comes from your perspective.
Yeah. So in the spring of last year, this is about after the legislative session, there was a conversation that began to circle with myself, a couple of my colleagues, some sportsmen's groups, and the division about two issues in particular: game cameras and baiting, and just general wanting to engage. The state was recognizing a problem. I think the users were recognizing some concerns, and there was a push to engage on that topic. And so that began in the beginning of the year. And here in the state of Utah, I'm not sure if your listeners are outside. It sounds like some of you are. So just for background, we have a process called that culminates with the Wildlife Board, but it has what are called Resource Advisory Councils, the RAC, if you've ever heard the term the RAC. And the RACs represent various regions across the state, and generally that's how issues relative to wildlife are resolved. And it's similar to what I described in the legislative process, but it's people who are appointed or elected to serve in these capacities discuss wildlife or wildlife related issues, everything from number of tags to means and methods, those types of things. Anyway, with that as context, when the conversation initially started with me, I indicated that this should probably be pursued through the RAC. I sit on the Northern RAC. That's generally how these things move forward, and that would be my preference to how it starts. And so that happened at the spring of the year. During the same time when I was working on when that conversation was happening, I was having a follow-up bill already pulled together. A couple of years ago, I designated in statute the Willard Spur waterfowl management area, and it's a 13,000 acre piece of ground between the Great Salt Lake and Willard Bay that prior had no designation. It was just it's the most biologically productive part of the Great Salt Lake. It's fantastic for duck hunting, and it was just sitting out there sort of without any management or oversight. And it had actually been identified as potential sites for a new water development plan. We have what's called the Bear River Development Act. And I was concerned that one of the best places for duck hunting in the state was just going to be turned into a reservoir, and all of that would be gone. So I established that a couple of years ago, but there was some cleanup language that needed to take place to fix maybe fix is the wrong word, to create some regulatory continuity across all waterfowl management areas. Because I designated the spur, and it was sort of an island, even though we have waterfowl management areas in Ogden and Bountiful and up in Box Elder County. And so I started drafting a bill to clean up that as part of a general wildlife bill. And that's sort of what, as that began to draft out, that was the initial context, was just a simple waterfowl cleanup bill. And there were some provisions about guiding and some basic definitions. You fast forward to the fall of the year, and the division came back in a conversation with me and some other legislators and said, hey, we've tried to make recommendations on baiting in the past. We've put groups together, and there are some other issues at play here that even though the biology is correct and the science is correct, we're not making changes. And so there was a request if I'd engage on that issue. Relative to cameras, however, in looking at what they could do through the RAC, it became apparent to the division that they did not have the authority to regulate game cameras just in statute. So it's sort of the Wild West with no rules or guidelines, and could not be handled through the RAC because they didn't have the authority to do so.
So
go ahead.
Real quick to interrupt you right there. Can you
Please
further define what that means with regards to the RAC not being able to tackle trail cameras?
Perfect.
Like in layman's terms, walk us through what exactly you're getting at there.
Great question. So the Wildlife Board and the RAC process were created by the state of Utah, and it gives the Division of Wildlife Resources the authority to engage on these issues. But the authority relative to the topic has to come from the state of Utah. We are ultimately the ones that created that, and we can say which issue they can or cannot engage on. So, for example, the division has the authority to set season dates and has the division to set tag numbers, but it may not necessarily have the legal authority to look at issues that are outside of its purview, because we set the parameters of what the Wildlife Board can and cannot do. And I don't think there's anything nefarious about that. It's just, this is a new and emerging technology that's never been addressed in statute. The state of Utah has done a few other things in law without giving the discretion to the Wildlife Board. But basically, even if the division wanted to do something in the RAC process, because the legislature had never given them guidance as to what, or even the very nature that they could do something in this space, without legal authorization, there is no other alternative to the process. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I appreciate the clarification. So let me ask you this. There's been a lot of folks wondering, I think the timing's right, is, well, why not then just draft a more generalized bill that would allow the Wildlife Board to make these type of decisions regarding trail cameras specifically? Because that seems like the main topic where they don't have the authority to do anything legally right now.
So I think there's two things going on here. One with baiting, the baiting and trail cameras are probably some of the hottest issues we're dealing with right now. I think you could put a host of others in this similar vein as to methods of take or ethics of hunting. But these two are some of the hottest. And on baiting in particular, the decision had already gone through the process and had not come with an outcome, even though there was recommendations coming from members of the Wildlife Board. They had the mule deer working group, which made recommendations and that were never taken up. So in my mind, and in talks with some of my constituents and others, the decision was made, rather than just say, make a decision totally on your own and let this play out in a in a very heated way, which it is currently playing out with my bill. Let's set the parameters of the debate. And I said, all right, in talks with talks with the division, why don't we just start the debate with what was already done in Nevada? I mean, it's immediately adjacent to us. They have the same sort of, or at least similar topography and weather. This is something that's already happened and has already taken shape. Let's start there as a talking point and as a beginning point of a conversation, and see how this evolves. And that's sort of the origin and the rationale behind saying, hey, let's frame this, rather than just saying, let's leave this to the Wild West, which, I mean, I'm sure you're hearing it in your circles. I'm hearing it in mine. This has pretty much got everybody split. Trail cams in particular, I would say, has everybody split right down the middle on both sides of the debate. Yeah,
I mean, part of the challenge that a lot of folks have voiced is that if this goes through the legislative route, it's so hard to move backwards once something is moved into a law, right? Like, there's super challenging to do that. Comparatively speaking, like if you run it through the wildlife side of the world and we're able to gain more public feedback, we can be more nimble in making changes for the betterment of, whatever ends up becoming a law, right? Like, you can evaluate something after maybe a year, maybe after 2 years, and the Wildlife Board, the department, can make those adjustments accordingly to have more flexibility, if you will, which essentially is going to impact everybody that's out hunting and recreating, versus the legislative route, where if we realize in a couple of years or so that maybe there isn't the impact or things have changed, it's going to be so much more challenging. And I think that's a point that's really been, verbalized by a lot of folks that are in the opposition corner.
So I understand maybe where that's coming from. I think if you look at federal politics, that's certainly the case. I mean, it takes decades or years and years, if not decades, to make changes. But at the state level, we're much more nimble. I think it may not have the permanency, which may cause the concern relative to rigidness, but we're literally discussing an idea right now, and the legislature re-engages on these issues all the time. We could come back in a year and have another 45-day session and make changes to statute. So I don't think one is necessarily less rigorous or less hard to change. I think maybe the will to change things maybe fluctuate, right? People in the wildlife space and in the Wildlife Board are always going to be willing to engage on wildlife issues. In the legislature, you have to have consistency in members and causes. and maybe that's causing some of the concern. But a lot at the state level, in my experience, and I believe it to be true, is as easy to adjust on an annual basis as a recommendation through the wildlife board process. Recognizing they are very different beasts in how they operate.
Okay, so one other thing we've kind of talked amongst ourselves about, and you see this in a lot of legislature, but there, to your point earlier, there was an initial idea surrounding waterfowl predominantly, and then through conversation and time, other topics were added into the same bill to create this overarching wildlife bill. What's the reasoning behind that versus tackling these things more individually? For example, a bill dedicated to the wildlife situation with regards to waterfowl, one about the baiting, one about trail cameras, versus this kind of broadscaping bill that's currently in front of us right now.
No, I think what we're having here in my bill and otherwise is a broader conversation about methods, ethics, and some small fixes. The bill started as a waterfowl bill, but I think has since progressed. I think there are pros and cons of running it both ways. The reality is we've started it in a conglomeration. I don't think it could happen outside of this as well. I think we've just chosen to take it as a lump approach, but I don't think there would be anything either against that or.
What's the reasoning though?
Go either way, I guess. Does that make sense? I think you could do it either way, and I think we pass legislation single topic or multiple topic all the time.
Sure. Is there a rhyme or reason why specifically? Just because again, they seem so very different. Obviously, there's more alignment with the trail cameras and the baiting, but the waterfowl is quite unique. And I'd say the most contentious part of the bill is certainly the trail cameras and the baiting. Yeah. Although I'm sure there's a select group of folks that are very passionate about the waterfowl language in it. What we're seeing in our group is predominantly on the big game side. So again, just any specific reasons why to clump it versus separate it, or is it just how it ended?
This is just how the process evolved this year with the discussion. We were already working on wildlife amendments generally when the decision came back to make some adjustments. And so that's the vehicle that was chosen. I think either way, this is just generally how legislation is formed. I don't think there would be any harm in to do it single issue. I also think that you could handle it this way as well, because it's a broader discussion about wildlife. Thus, it's a broader bill about wildlife.
Okay, so circling back to kind of the timeline of the bill. So in the fall, you kind of were approached again and mentioned that you're kind of looking to mirror it with the Nevada model from that standpoint. So with that, like, were you able to learn anything specifically from the folks in Nevada of like how their bill that's been in law for a couple of years has been impacting various components, whether that be tag allocation, the age class of the animals, any kind of data were you able to gather from the Nevada Department of Wildlife?
So we didn't talk about harvest rates or age classes. I think part of that is there's not been long-term specific studies to that regard. But the one thing that came clear in the Nevada model was the enforceability piece. And that's why those dates were selected. It's easier to enforce a change rather than doing it sort of piecemeal. I know, look, other states other than Nevada have tried other means with game cameras. You've got what Montana's done. Idaho's talked about where Arizona's going. The Nevada model, based on the conversations that were had, seemed to be the most enforceable on trail cams in particular. And rather than putting good people who are otherwise law abiding at a disadvantage because of nuance, the decision was made to have sort of one date that everybody knew, just like we do with hunting seasons, so that it was easy to follow and didn't have holes in it that could cause some people to take advantage of the law is the biggest concern. It's even as structured, I recognize that the enforceability pieces are somewhat tricky, which is why we've put some of that issue back into the division for discussion in the second substitute on my bill. But that is the rationale for making that determination. I think across the board, there isn't long-term data which has been specifically tied to cameras.
So just to clarify real quick, did yourself or any part of the department regarding Utah contact anybody in the Nevada department prior to the introduction?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Here's my question. Let's get to the brass tacks of this thing. When I would assume when we pass a law or new legislation goes in, like we're trying to solve a problem. And this is what I think a lot of people are having a trouble with. What problem are we trying to solve by outlawing or putting a season on game cams?
Yeah, I think there's a recognition that there are widespread proliferation of these. There are cameras on nearly every water source. There are hunter to hunter conflicts. And I think there's a broader question about, is it fair to have one animal targeted all season long with multiple cameras? Do we violate fair chase when we've documented an animal 24/7? I think those are fundamental issues. And I think we weigh into these issues all the time. I mean, this debate is robust and passionate right now, which I appreciate, but we do these on means and methods of take all the time. So spotlighting, for example, use of drones, airplanes. The legislature passed a law a couple of years ago that said you have to physically be there to take an animal, because there was advancements in technology that literally let you pull up your cell phone, not hold the trigger, but say, that's the deer I want to kill and I'm going to kill it. And all of those are based on sort of the social pressures that come. You know, we don't have rigorous data when we're making a decision to say we don't spotlight in this state, but we determined that that was unethical and not fair to the animal. And I think we've progressed that way with cameras, and thus the reason to have this debate in the public space.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we have these talks amongst ourselves all the time, right? And if we're talking about ethics, and I've heard you use the phrase, put the hunt back in hunting. How do we decide what is ethical and what's not ethical? Because if you look at, technology, right? That's what's changing everything is technology. Yeah. But technology started 100 years ago. If we want to get back to how hunting started, it would be literally going out and carving your own spear and going out and harvesting animal that way. Right. So where, in my opinion, where is the line drawn in the sand? It's different for everybody. I think it's very hard to manage or to pass laws based on ethics because everybody's has different ethics. If you want to talk about, putting the hunt back in hunting, I think the biggest piece of technology that has helped hunters is the rangefinder. The rangefinder has rewrote the record books. Long range shooting, Utah just passed a law a couple of years ago that you can put any scope on a muzzleloader, and there are guys that are shooting 600 yards. So why trail cameras? Why is it coming down to trail cameras?
Great question. I actually agree with you. I think there's a variety of technologies that we need to discuss, right? And I want to make sure, one of the things I want to make clear to your listeners is, in this debate, I'm not pointing fingers, and there isn't some superiority on my part. All the things that I'm talking about in my bill, I have done. And, I have one of those muzzle loaders that shoots a long way. And I use a rangefinder, all these things. This is as much about a conversation I've got to have with myself as it is with constituents in the broader community. But I think from time to time, what has been a fundamental part of who we are as sportsmen is we always evaluate ourselves relative to times and technology, right? I think a lot of people forget that the reason we can even have wildlife to look, let alone hunt, is because sportsmen made a decision. Hey, we're going to do seasons. We're not going to kill deer, elk, waterfowl, whatever in the spring. We're the ones that self-advocated to put taxes on the gear that we buy and the ammunition that we use to pay for places for additional things. I think this conversation right now, as technology is rapidly progressing, is just a fundamental conversation that we always have. And it's just not unique to Utah, right? Idaho's made decisions on muzzle loaders that are very different than what we've made in the state of Utah. And that came down to a basic, majority conversation. And I think that's all we're having here. I'm actually not opposed to having broader conversations. I think the division should, and I think it's a good, healthy process to always check our appetites against the game we pursue. This is just one conversation we're having now, but I don't think this has a bullseye on it any way different than another method, for sure.
That's
Just
what
so
I think a lot of people struggle with that because, a lot of people are asking like, how does this affect or impact Utah's conservation goals or harvest objections? And so they're saying, the conversation is like, if we're getting tags, like you guys are giving us tags to harvest animals, then why this conversation? If you want, if we're allotted these tags and you want them harvested, then why are you trying to regulate how or what tools we use to get them? But I get
Right.
what you're saying with like, yes, like this goes beyond all the tools we have now, what's coming in the future and how will we regulate those. But everyone's wondering, how does this bill help or affect our overall conservation goals in the state of Utah?
Well, I think maybe it's kind of come to this, but I think a license is not necessarily a guarantee. And maybe we've progressed to where we feel like it ought to be, especially on limited entry units or something like that. But I have always felt that my hunting license or my fishing license is the opportunity to hunt fish.
Mm-hmm.
And we have the technology to literally wipe out anything on the mountain. I mean, we can't. And I think the question is it really hunting when I put up 150 trail cams and I watch a deer in its bed and I know where it's going to feed and I put out a bait set and I document his whole life and then I kill him over a bait? That to me is to the point where we're not talking about hunting, we're talking about killing. And you're right, the division is setting quotas based on biologically what an area can handle. I totally agree with that. And honestly, with some of our depredation tags or cow tags, we're making a decision to go another way and to apply pressure specifically from the killing aspect, right? Like those are different conversations. But I think fundamentally hunting is still hunting. And when we make it a guarantee, we've moved past something. And I think cameras, look, I don't fundamentally have a problem with a guy putting out a couple. And honestly, we're having a discussion generally about big numbers, but I think there's something fundamentally different between your weekend warrior that wants to put a few cameras out versus an outfitter that may be purchasing images off 1,500 cameras, or one Instagram warrior that's got 150 cameras. The incentives and the rationale for making those decisions are fundamentally different between those two. And I think we've got to have a conversation about it. And that's what clearly this has spurred that debate.
Yeah, so a couple things to point out, just to think about. The example of the guy that's running 90 or 150 cameras, I've heard you mention that several times, either in our conversation, during your presentation, in emails and social media posts that you made on like some forums. Does that exist? Certainly. But again, I think that's like an extreme on one side of the argument that wouldn't necessarily transfer all across the state. Like I don't think the majority of folks hunting in the state of Utah are running anywhere near that. I think most people are running a couple. Same thing with the notion that every water hole is just, littered with cameras. The image used in the presentation showed one, of a juniper that was just covered. Again, I think that's certainly not the norm. I think there's zones within the state or hunting units specifically that you may see more of a problem than you would in other areas. But unfortunately, the language in the bill is just overarching the entire state. And so I think a lot of people are upset in the sense that isn't what they're seeing. That isn't what they're accustomed to. I think it appears, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like this bill is really targeting archery hunters that are hunting mule deer, specifically maybe in a limited entry area and potentially the southern part of the state. Do you agree or disagree with that notion?
No, I disagree with that notion. It's not targeted at archery hunters or muzzleloader hunters or rifle hunters. It's targeted at the use of the technology. One of the reasons I would even say that is I've had several muzzleloader hunters call me and say, why are you doing the archers a service in this? You're letting them pull their cameras 2 weeks before the hunt. If you make them pull it 2 weeks before the hunt, the 1st of August, by the time my hunt rolls around several months later, the cameras are basically worthless. So that's sort of the notion of that I'd hope to dispel, that this is somehow specific to archers. I think the areas that you highlight are probably where these issues are the most rampant. But I'm in a limited entry unit up here in the cache, and I am seeing cameras at that level. Not on nearly every water hole there's a camera, and on some I could pull the exact same photo that was shared in committee. So I do think it's a statewide issue. Now, back to the number of the extremes that I've referenced. Absolutely, I think I think most guys are running no more than 10, probably closer to 5. But when you have people out there that are running that huge number, we really are taking the hunt out of hunting. And I think if you're going to put 150 cameras out there, let's say it's the transmitting cameras and you're $500 a pop, you're 75 grand. If they're on that lower end, you're maybe $15,000 in investment. But I think the notion that these cameras aren't having an impact and they're not allowing us to target deer is sort of undermined by the very dollars that we place into making them happen. No one is going to spend that kind of money if it doesn't help them target or be successful on a very specific animal. And I think that's the fundamentals of this bill, where when I say fair chase or the hunt back in hunting, the results speak for themselves, and the investments indicate that this is doing the very thing that people are wanting it to do. And thus the need for a conversation about whether or not we should have restraint on some of these activities.
Tell me this, Casey, we built our brand Hush on a couple different pillars, things that we think are really important and kind of our why of why we want to do this. We're very passionate about the outdoors, hunting and fishing and everything in between. One of the things that we feel very passionate about is new hunter recruitment, right? So part of our job of uploading videos or doing whatever we might do is to hopefully inspire people to get out. If it's a youth, if it's a guy that used to hunt with his dad that gave it up for a while, whatever it might be, we want more people in the woods. Absolutely. How does this bill help that? Do you think this bill will encourage more people to get out into the woods?
Well, I don't know that my bill is targeted at that demographic or that issue specifically. So I don't know how it would help. And I don't know how it would hurt. I know I've heard the argument that if I have a season, I can't bring my kids out, and I do that in the fall, which I understand what you're saying from that perspective. I don't necessarily believe that this bill is targeted for recruitment, for or against. I do share the concern though, right? Utah's sort of bucking the trend. We especially in the last couple of years, we've had more participation than maybe other states. But I think we do need to have a conversation about recruitment, because ultimately what you're seeing in places like California, for example, is when non-hunters reach a sort of a threshold where it can push every piece of legislation or every regulatory rule to hunting without the political ability to stop it, then you've really created a problem. And honestly, that concern is what motivated me to run my constitutional right to hunt and fish last year, is long-term trends that are not showing new people in the sport. And we need to have buffers against our sport going away, because there are way more non-hunters than hunters. So I share the concern. It's a valid and legitimate concern.
One of the things I've been reading and hearing about, and I think it's true too, is I don't think it's going to help get more people out. I think it's going to hurt. I really do. I think with the way Utah's going with even, I grew up hunting the cache. We'd go rifle deer hunt cache every year. It was a big family party. Well, now, Utah's gone to these draws for, even your general season deer tags, which are causing people not to get out. I think the trend in Utah is going the wrong way. I think it's preventing more people from getting out, showing their kids the outdoors. And this just adds to it, man. Like, I've heard this concern with a lot of people, especially people that hunt different states like we do, is there's just so many rules and regulations anymore. It's just hard to keep up on. And you look at, like, I heard a guy talking about somewhere back east where they'll give non-residents as many deer tags as they want, because the residents aren't hunting anymore, because there's so many rules and regulations on all of it. And this is just adding to it. I know a lot of people like just to get out and trail cam animals with their family. They might not even have a tag, but they just want to get out with their family, set trail cams, and it's just another way to get your kids excited about the outdoors.
No, I get it. And I mean, I would say that's sort of why we're trying to split the baby and have a season rather than a prohibition. I get it. You know, when your general season elk tags are sold out in one day, try telling, you know, if your kids had a soccer game that day and you didn't sign up at 7 o'clock in the morning to apply for your rifle tag and get in this queue, you were done. I mean, myself, I sat on there for hours and I signed on at 8:15 in the morning, right? So I get it. There's a lot of hurdles to this, and I'm not trying to make it harder because I recognize the challenges. But I do think in the broader conversation, we have to have these conversations about where is technology going and what is it fundamentally changing with our relationship to the wildlife we're pursuing, right? And I think that's the impetus behind this. It's like, of course I don't want to have less recruitment. Of course I have little kids, right? My daughter is 7 years old and we're getting her into hunting because I drag her along on hikes, shed hunting. You know, I talk to her about wildlife. When I bring home the elk at the end of the year, I make sure she's in there pulling it apart with me, right? And we go through all of it. I'm trying to do the same thing that you're talking about. And I'm not trying to fundamentally limit that. But I think we have to have this conversation about technology and wildlife while we're also bringing our children into the sport. And that's sort of the impetus behind this anyway.
So what would you say to people that are asking, well, why is trail cameras the big technology focal point of this, when Utah historically has been exceptionally liberal, if you would compare them to other Western states, on what is currently legal means of methods to take, right? Whether that be, the Garmin digital range finding bow sight, that could be, the muzzleloader situation that Casey referenced earlier. It could be illuminated nocks. It could be illuminated sight. I mean, the list truthfully goes on where it's really technology driven and based, and currently all legal means to hunt in Utah. So why is trail cameras kind of like getting more targeted right now, specifically comparatively to other things that are actually already legal and have been for quite some time in many cases? So
I think trail cameras and baiting are having the conversation about them right now, because that's just the conversation just had to start somewhere. And I think that's probably some of the most visible things that we're seeing. I will say, so I've obviously gotten a lot of feedback on this, as you can imagine. And one of the individuals I spoke with yesterday indicated that there may be some benefit to having sort of a standard or a established conversation about a committee, or I don't know what you would structure it at, but some sort of body that is able to look at these technologies as we go forward. Because, right, I think this came to a head on cameras because you started having cameras that started transmitting video and sending text messages. I think that's progressed a long ways from the incandescent bulbs that we had 20, 30 years ago. And that's why it's hit this point. But we got stuff coming down the pipe that I think is scarier than anything we've seen yet. I mean, this forward-facing infrared, I think, is as scary a technology that exists out there. The ability to look at a mountain and see every deer on there based on their heat signature is a huge conversation that needs to happen. And I don't think a process where we chase or play whack-a-mole every time a technology pops up is a good long-term strategy. I think we need to be able to have some sort of standing vehicle or standing avenue to discuss this, because I think we all got to recognize hunting has become more competitive in the last maybe couple of decades than it's ever been. And there's obviously the pressures with social media and things. And we have to check ourselves against the technologies that we're inventing. We've always had to do that in sport. I think we always will have to do it.
Let me ask you this. When it comes to technology, trail cameras versus some of the means we just spoke about, the variable scope muzzleloaders, the Garmin type digital, bow sight, those other components that are currently legal seem to have a direct impact on somebody's successful ability to harvest an animal. I mean, they're legitimately tied into the fact of taking an animal, whereas trail cameras, you could argue, don't have that same ability. Like, could they be helpful? Certainly, but are they actually, a resource that is legitimately taking an animal? I would argue probably not. How do you speak to that? Because that is another topic that has come up of, again, the things that are legal genuinely are 100% impacting your ability to kill an animal, versus a trail camera could be an aid, but it certainly is not helping you kill the animal based on its technology.
No, I think that's fair. And on the muzzleloader side, I remember when they put scopes on muzzleloaders, and as soon as it was legal, I went and I bought the Remington Ultimate muzzleloader and I put a scope on it, right? Because that's what the law said, and that's what I use. And I think the difference being, one, we're starting the discussion here on those technologies, and I am not opposed to a broader conversation. I think we all need to have that conversation. All the points that are brought up are legitimate and need to be part of a broader debate. I think that there's a fundamental difference that I think you're pointing out, and I think it's fair. One is at the point of the trigger, or at the end of the, it's that immediate interaction between the hunter and what is being hunted, right? Like I'm more accurate, I can shoot further, I can see better, whatever. The other comes down to, is it equally as ethical if I can document an animal through the course of its life and make decisions relative to when and where I'm going to be somewhere? And especially as it comes to these transmitting cameras, I can set a bait, I can get a text message, it puts me in a position where these other technologies then also come into play. So I don't think they're completely divided from each other. I think they're hand in glove. Now, I recognize there's some fundamental differences, right? And again, as I pointed out, but I think they're all part of the similar conversation about, have we come too far, that needs to be had in our sport.
So what would you say, what are your thoughts then? Because right now, like cellular transmitted cameras and your standard non-transmitted cameras are kind of being lumped into one category, when in reality, they're quite different from one another. Why not separate out the trail cameras that are transmitting data cellularly and tackle that one? Because that certainly seems to be gaining more support of folks saying, I get it. Like that's certainly more, ethically in question than your traditional fixed camera, where, in order to check it, you got to go put in the effort, you got to pull the card. There's work behind it. It's different, and it's very, very different than the cellular camera. Is there a possibility to separate those two and tackle those more on an individual basis?
I want to have that conversation. I think it's fair to say we are lumping. I do think there are places where those are more of an issue, and it's generally where there's cell service, right? Like I think there are places where you can put those transmitting cameras and good luck, they're not going to work. But I think we can't leave the debate on cameras generally alone based on the sheer proliferation, right? Like we've 150 cameras that I can document throughout the season is having an impact. We have to have this discussion. And this conversation had to start somewhere, where we've clearly started it. I am open to ideas and suggestions. I really am. That may not come across in some of the forums. I don't know if you've seen some of the things I've tried to post in the different spaces, and I'm legitimately soliciting feedback. And as I started this conversation, there's still a lot of space that this bill has to cover, or a lot of ground it has to cover before this conversation really comes to some finality. So I think that's a fair point. I think maybe if someone had ideas relative to the season, because my bills don't come from Mount Sinai, right? Like God did not write HB 295. So I want to have a discussion.
Let's jump into that real quick. We kind of have bounced around a little bit, but we've heard some generalizations about how the bill was brought to your attention. I think you referenced folks from the division, some of your colleagues, and some conservation groups. Can we have like a more specific definition of like who are truthfully the people that are bringing this to your attention? When you say the division, help us further understand, what does that mean? Is it the enforcement folks? Is this coming from biologists? Is this coming from the administrative side? Who in the division was leading that? When you talk conservation groups, Can you be more specific with regards to like what conservation groups are you mentioning? Just trying to gain like more clarity of like the why behind it and like where did it truthfully originate from?
Yeah, well, so when I say the division, it's not like I went down and got lunch with somebody that works down there and said, hey, what do you think about this idea? Right. So the conversations began with people that we work with who then took it into the division for a review. Right. So these conversations have gone and at least been had with the biology and the enforcement and the higher ups within management of the division. So this wasn't just this shot in the dark fly by night conversation, and it took almost a year to have.
Sure.
You know, and in that, you know, I'm over the hunting and fishing caucus, and so I have the ability to engage with lawmakers that care about these issues from all over the state. And those people I was talking to, in that same vein, we regularly invite a variety of sportsmen's groups that are there. You know, my hunting and fishing caucus has members from bow hunters and BHA and SFW and Trout Unlimited and Mule Deer Foundation, RMEF, you know, like the gamut of people. Now, I'm not saying every individual in every organization was consulted in that process. I'm not, but I'm saying I've tried to at least have the conversation with as many folks as I've can sort of quietly. And then as pieces were pulled together, I ultimately have the ownership and the buck stops with me on the bill. So at the fundamental level where we're at now, this is my bill based on those conversations that have had.
So with regards to conservation groups, is there like, we did a little bit of, you know, homework to try to get a gauge on who is in opposition, who is currently in support of the bill. Of the kind of the major groups, is there one over another that was really driving force behind supporting this and helping you, encourage you to get this idea introduced into a bill?
I think I've had a variety of conversations. I will say, to their credit, SFW's probably been the strongest and loudest voice on this issue. And I think a lot of people, and I'm not sure why, I maybe question that, but I think to SFW's credit in this debate, they have taken it on the chin, both in membership and support. But I believe SFW is doing it because they believe it's the right thing, as do I, to have this conversation. So, and that primarily be who's engaging at this point. But I'm open to suggestions or feedback from just about anybody.
What about like Mule Deer Foundation? What was their feedback?
Miles and I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago about this, and they didn't know where they were going to be on it at the end of the day. I've talked to a couple of the local people at BHA, but this was after it was introduced, which is also part of the process. Like at some point in a debate, we got to stop having conversations about an abstract idea and have a specific one. So that's what we've got right now with HB 295 is here is your specific idea. Let's weigh in on it. And I think that's why, and I'm taking feedback on it. I think that's why you'd see, we had the initial draft, which came out a week, 10 days before committee. In committee, we had one amendment and then one substituted bill. So, and just for those who aren't familiar with the process, basically anything over 15 words of changes constitutes a substitute. So that's why it's called the substitute. I think in this debate, as we move forward, I'm open to additional changes. So there were conversations that occurred early on, and what I hope is that there are conversations occurring now, because sorry, I got to apologize.
Oh, you're all right.
Sorry, somebody called me and it bumped me off Zoom.
Yeah, no worries.
What I was trying to say is this conversation has begun, but this conversation is not over. And so all those parties, your listeners, the forums, everything else, I'm open to suggestions.
So let me ask you this. Hold on, Casey, real fast. I want to just kind of curtail this point about conservation groups. Does it bring up any concern if the majority of the conservation groups are in opposition of this bill? Mule Deer Foundation responded to an inquiry from us stating that They're in opposition to the bill. I'm happy to read you the email. Backcountry Hunters and Anglers has come out in opposition of the bill. Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation hasn't made a comment yet. We were told that their corporate office had just kind of had an opportunity to look at the language.
Hey, Brian, I didn't hear that last one. Sorry, my phone cut out.
Oh yeah, I said, so Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation responded and said that they had just received the bill in its entirety and hadn't had an opportunity to digest, so they haven't made a stance on it. So essentially, Mule Deer Foundation is in opposition, Backcountry Hunters and Anglers is in opposition, RMEF is undecided at this point, and then SFW is in support. Do you have any concern with the idea that only one of the four major groups are currently in support of the bill?
Well, I think that goes to the broader discussion that these conversations are ongoing. I'm actually a little bit surprised to hear that from MDF. That is, I believe you. So let me phrase that. I believe you, but that's just a different conversation than I had last week.
Let me read it real quick. So the email says, and I quote, MDF didn't support it because we felt it went too far. And we feel like this type of management should be done by the wildlife agency, not legislation. We hope there may be an opportunity to amend or modify the bill in the future, unquote.
Yeah. And I think that's fair. And I think that goes to the very heart of what I'm trying to say in this is that we've started the discussion. The discussion is not over. And honestly, since this has been introduced, I've probably spent 30 hours out of every 24 engaging on this and soliciting feedback. And this heated conversation is far from perfect and far from done.
Sure.
Real quick. So we talked earlier about how these bills go from idea to law. Tell us exactly where this bill is at right now.
So it came out of committee last week on, was that Friday? Thursday or Friday?
Friday.
It came out of committee 11-3. And then, so there was the initial draft, went to committee. We made some changes. It's now going to the House floor where we're discussing changes. I think there'll be changes in the next round of this. Once it passes the House, it'll go to the Senate committee where we can still have discussion and whatever, and then the Senate. So it's probably a 5-step process. Sorry, am I glitching again? I apologize. Yeah. I'll summarize. We're step 1 of 5. We've completed step 1 of 5.
Okay.
And it's still going to have debate, discussion, changes, everything else.
So at the conclusion of this 5-step process, what is the date that it could become a bill if it continued forward? Like, when's the session end and when would the governor eventually see it on his desk?
So the session's over the first or second week of March. And then usually our bills don't go into effect till May or June. There's some provisions in there as it's currently constituted that will require additional wildlife board feedback. And I suspect that'll take another year or so. I think this process has got a long way to go.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So a couple of things I wanted to kind of circle back on. The presentation that you utilized in the hearing was a blend of, like a PowerPoint with some photos and such. There was a couple of things that were brought to our attention that we even noticed that seemed slightly out of context with regards to photos of a live deer via a trail camera, and then what would be considered like a trophy photo of an individual with a successful harvest. And essentially was that the trail camera led to the successful take of that deer. There were a certain couple examples used that we know the individuals that were in the photos, even though their faces were blurred out, we knew of their hunt. And the reality is, like, the context wasn't accurate, right? Like the cameras, yes, there was a photo of the deer, but in one instance of the example, it was someone else's trail camera photo. So the hunter that was successful in the take, it wasn't his trail camera. And where he took that deer, there was no cameras in that particular basin. Another example was a gentleman who successfully took a deer. Again, a photo of it where he took the deer wasn't near his camera and really had no impact. There was no baiting involved in either situation. It just painted a picture, particularly what was in concern is the committee members that maybe weren't as familiar with hunting and what that presentation appeared, even though some of the details and the context weren't necessarily in line with kind of the message that you were trying to portray. What would you say to that concern that has risen here recently since the hearing?
So I'd say a couple of things on that. I think the underlying premise of that, and I mentioned two things in that debate. One, that this was all done legally and ethically under current law, and that I think there was some of those photos I think had been mineraled, but that debate was generally focused around trail cams. The video was 100% around baiting, right at the end of the discussion.
Correct.
But what people are indicating is that trail cameras have no impact on targeting of animals or success of the hunt. And I don't think you can say, if I get it on camera, that it's not providing some benefit to me. That fundamentally is, here's the picture of the deer. We know that it's up there. We are adjusting methods consistent with that. And I'm not saying that the deer was shot off the camera site. Of course, I'm not saying that, but I am saying that the camera at least aided in the take of that. Otherwise, there's no need. Why even put the camera up there in the first place? Because I'm in this debate hearing consistently that cameras, show me the data. Well, cameras have no impact, and I'm trying to say, look, here is visual proof that cameras do assist in the taking or identification or selection of specific
animals. Identification, I would say identification, you could argue, right? So in this example, for example, like Casey, you had a trail camera and you caught a photo of a deer, but then Eric killed that deer, even though he never had the camera out or had no knowledge of it. This happens all the time where a guy will say, hey, I noticed you got this deer. I have a photo of it. Check it out. Here you go. Super cool. It had absolutely zero impact on Eric's ability to successfully take that deer because you're the one that got the camera in place and you're the one that got it on picture, a picture to share. So like that was one of the examples that was shared where the gentleman legitimately killed a deer in a basin that didn't have cameras, but somebody else certainly had captured it. We see that all the time where that camera has virtually zero impact on the success of the hunter taking it. Yes, it's documented, no doubt about it, but that person did not benefit whatsoever. It is simply, an afterthought of, hey, here's a cool photo or a video of this animal you got. We run across that all the time. Eric has several examples, even from this past year, where people have sent him photos of animals we never knew existed. He was lucky enough to punch his tag on it, but it had zero impact. Now, there's a potential part of that where, that's kind of a cool part of telling the story. Like, look, I've got this great picture. So again, this is the context of the presentation. I understand where you're going for it, but in many cases, the camera certainly didn't impact the hunter's ability to kill the animal, certainly become aware of it potentially. But in cases like we've experienced, we didn't know the animal existed until after people saw it posted and were like, hey man, here's a photo of that animal you got. What would you say with regards to that response?
I think that's fair. I mean, I think that does happen. And I think you've highlighted that it does. For purposes of the presentation, and I stand by it, I think what is trying to be illustrated is you heard in the discussion after, and I had heard it in the forums prior, that I never kill a deer that I caught on camera. It never does, never helps me, doesn't do anything. You're just taking away something from me. And what I'm trying to illustrate is, no, that's not necessarily always the case. And here's proof. And so for visual, that's what was shown. Here's a picture of
even
deer.
Though
So I am not familiar with every instance. So what those photos came to me, to be fair, from in this debate with other people, right? So every deer, I'm not familiar with every hunter and every deer that came in that video presentation, to be completely transparent. But I think for the purposes of the debate, I think it does show that there's a correlation between cameras and taking. I don't think we can make the argument that it doesn't have any impact, but guys, we all know that it does. It doesn't in every instance. It doesn't in every instance, right? But I think we have all had
exactly
something we've killed, and I think that's the discussion we're trying to have.
Well,
here's the reality. If you're going to share stuff on a hearing to committee members, particularly the ones that aren't as familiar with hunting, I think it is important that there's a story and a context behind the images and the information that's being shared, because the perception, if you didn't know the story, is that every single one of those deer that were being held was killed because of a trail camera. The reality is that just wasn't the case. And had the people that shared those images with you, and or had you done the due diligence, you could have identified that, man, these are not the right situations to share in this presentation. Are there ones out there that are correlating where a camera helps kill or bait help kill? 100%. We're not arguing that. But I think it's important that if you're going to share that publicly, you got to know the details of the story. And I think that was a misrepresentation. And, you know, a lot of people were very upset about that had knowledge of those situations in those particular hunts.
I think the underlying premise of this, however, which is we're trying to make the argument that cameras don't have an impact, and that this doesn't need to be regulated because it's not helping us. Guys, I've got this call. I'm really sorry. They keep calling. Are you there?
Yeah.
Sorry, my 9 o'clock is like, where the crap are you? So they're texting me and calling me. I wish we would have had this good, lively debate earlier in the podcast, because I don't want to leave it hanging here. But I think fundamentally, again, the fundamental premise on this bill, the fundamental conversation we're trying to have here is that trail cameras have an impact. We need to have this conversation, and we can bat around specifics, but I really think all of us know that there's a correlation, and that's the fundamental point here. But
so let me ask you this. I know you're running short on time.
They are calling me.
That's fine.
Let me tell them anyway, let me just shoot them a text and I'll try and get a couple more minutes. I do need to jump off, guys. I'm really sorry. Anyway, go ahead.
That's all right.
So let me just finish with a couple quick things here. We literally have, you know, pages more of questions and stuff, and we understand your time is valuable. So if we got to wrap it up, we'll wrap it up. So if people want to oppose this bill, or if people want to support this bill, what is the best way for the public to make their voice heard? Because what we saw in the committee meeting is there's just a finite amount of time. A very small percentage of folks were able to participate in providing feedback. And again, that's another overarching concern of this entire bill is, why is it going so fast? What is the rush? Why don't we have an opportunity to voice our opinion? You've obviously, you know, been willing to jump on with us, which we're super grateful for. You've posted things in various forums or social media. You know, it certainly seems like you're trying to receive more input. That being said, we're 1/5 of the way through this potentially becoming a law. You know, to your point, are there opportunities to take more feedback, to make changes? Certainly. However, we realize that through the political process, it's super challenging for the public to be heard, because you just have such little time during these hearings, or whether it's, you know, available for public comment. So if our audience, anybody that's listening to this, wants to provide their feedback, what is the right means to do, whether, again, in support or in opposition? We just want to direct people and encourage them to get involved in this process.
Yeah. So, and I think people are doing it. There's the emails, texts, phone calls, which have all come to me or to my colleagues. And I think that's the part that does this. You know,
So would you, real quick, so if people want to write emails, would they be better benefited to write it to the House of Representatives? Would they be better represented to send it to the Senate? Would it be better to send it to the Natural Resources Committee? Who should be receiving this information?
Well, I think ultimately everybody's going to have a vote or a voice on this, right? So there isn't one focal point. I think there's,
I mean, here's
hang on. So in my district, I represent 40,000 people. Those are the 40,000 people whose opinion I primarily care about. And I am on the Natural Resources Committee, and I'm on the floor of the House as a member. I listen to those people. If people are just going to start sending willy-nilly emails, they're likely to be disregarded, because that's just not how the process works, right? So I would, if people want to engage, I would engage the person who represents you, because that's their job. So.
Excellent. Yeah, we want thoughtful, you know, respectful, well-written emails to be served. There's a tremendous amount of participation on social media, but the reality is the majority of your colleagues they're not going to see that. They're not going to look into that. You're obviously proactively engaging with some of that, so you're probably going to see it more so than others. We just want to find out where's the right place for folks to be able to be heard. This is obviously a very contentious bill. There's a lot of emotion behind it. There's a lot of opinions behind it. And that's all we're trying to do is direct folks in the right way that are still maybe a little more unfamiliar with how this process works.
Yeah, I would call or write your representative. That's their job, is to represent your viewpoint. So I think throughout the process, you have one senator, you have one House member. That's where I would point any positives or negatives for sure.
Excellent. Well, you're always welcome back on here as this progresses through various steps. And, we've got plenty more questions and stuff. I'm sure more will come down the road.
Yeah. And I'd love to talk about hunting generally and some of these broader topics. This is the one of the day, but I plan on, being engaged in this space. There's not a lot of us up on the hill that like to hunt and fish. So I'm hoping we could have a conversation on this today, and then maybe something else will come up as questions or policy ideas wind themselves through the process.
Most definitely.
Excellent.
We appreciate
Thanks,
your time,
guys.
Casey.
I really appreciate it. I'm sorry to sign. I didn't know this was going to go more than an hour, or I would have booked additional time. I apologize.
No worries. No worries at all.
So
we'll be in touch.
See ya.
Thanks.
Yeah. Let's just wrap it up amongst ourselves.
Yeah, a couple things I wish we could have got to with him before he would have gone. He talks about, just me thinking as he was talking through trail cameras, and if they do help or they don't help, obviously he thinks they do. We've talked amongst ourselves. I've never killed an animal that I had on trail camera. It's never assisted me. I think what gets a lot of guys scared of anytime anything is taken away is what's next, right? So trail cameras get taken away today. What's next? Well, 99.9% of the animals I've killed are because of these right here, optics. And that's either from pre-scouting in the summer, in the fall, or just spotting an animal and going and killing it. This is technology that has taken us to a new place, right? 99.9% of the animals I've killed are because of those. Our optics next. Why are optics any different than a trail camera?
Well, the argument is you were physically up there.
Yeah, I get that. But I also think, like we talked earlier, I think the whole idea of taking, he even admitted that most guys are running 1 to 5 trail cameras, right? I think it's taking away a tool that the 9 to 5 guys use, right? Like, guys have full-time jobs. They don't have a lot of time to go out, sit on the side of the mountain and glass and pre-scout. They're counting on their 1 to 5, 1 to 5 trail cameras they're running to hopefully tell them that there's a deer coming to the water hole. Or,
to just get them in the general area.
Yeah.
Like, here's somewhere with a couple bucks you'd be happy to hunt.
These deer crossed here 2 weeks ago. Yeah.
I mean, that's been an argument that I think has been debated is who stands to benefit more so, or who stands to be more impacted. Obviously a lot of the examples where folks are running, 100 cams or more, not always, but in many cases are outfitters or guides, right? Like, that's the reality. So if we take that away from them, there's folks that are arguing that, well, that's going to level the playing field. But I think, I would argue that I don't think it will. To Casey's point, I think the average hunter that has a family, has a job, is trying to just, get out on the hill, and they can only spend a couple days a year hunting. I think trail cameras will potentially, help them level the playing field. Now, if they don't have that opportunity, well, how's that going to impact outfitters and guides? Personally, I think they'll just put more people on the field. They'll spend more time in the field. They have the resources. They have the time. It is legitimately their job. Prior to trail cameras, guides always killed oftentimes older age class deer, elk, bigger deer, elk. I don't think it's going to impact them in the least. Now, they may have to charge more money because they're going to be faced with a higher payroll cost because they're putting more folks on the mountain. But I don't think it's going to impact their ability to be successful at all. I really don't. I think they'll continue to, be very successful. And the average guy is going to be the one that's like showing up on this hunt that they just waited 15 to 20 years to draw a tag on. They don't have the ability to use a camera, and they're only, available to hunt a handful of days. To me, I think they're going to be way behind.
Well,
Thoughts?
Ryan Carter made a great point the other day on Facebook. Ryan Carter's an outfitter down in Southern Utah. He runs 80 to 100 cameras, right? He said this is not going to affect him as much as it is going to affect the everyday guy. If a guy is running 80 to 100 cameras, that is a full-time job. 10 to 15 cameras is a full-time job. 80 to 100 cameras spread out on a mountain is like a small group of guys' full-time job. If he gets those cameras taken away, he can't use them. He's still going to be out there in the woods because he has the time to do it. What Ryan Carter is trying to say is this is going to affect the everyday hunter way more so than it is the outfitters or guides.
We had literally pages of stuff. I mean, the amount of effort, research, talking to people, looking at forums that we put in over the last 4 or 5 days is something I never would have expected. This kind of materialized that I sent an email just kind of trying to gain clarity to Representative Snider. Was asking some questions about kind of the why, and he replied with, "What's your cell phone number?" We ended up talking for about 45 minutes last week on Thursday. And that's where I asked if he'd be willing to jump on this podcast. Well, fast forward to Friday was the actual subcommittee hearing where he did his presentation. And that's where it generated even more, contention because the public were able to comment on how they felt about it. The challenge here is they only listened to a few folks. There was quite a few people in the actual chamber that it was being heard. There was more people in an overflow room. There was probably about 100 people online. In the end, there was 11 people in opposition that spoke publicly. There was 9 people in support and a whole pile of more folks that weren't able to be heard. And, that was like the main objective behind this podcast, is trying to get more information out there. Again, we had a lot of questions where we just, wanted to dig deeper and find out like, what are the reasons behind these various things? If you guys have been paying attention, following along, whether on the legislative page or on various social media posts, just doing research, it's not hard to see like there's a lot of varying opinions and discussions on this. I think, at the end of the day, it's tough to be in support of it personally because it's such a broad-scaping amount of language in one bill. I think we can have an honest conversation about some stuff, right? Like cellular trail cameras, I think, is one that would probably generate more support than opposition if we had that secluded out from standard trail cameras. I think the baiting situation is one that probably could gain more support than the trail cameras. To me, the typical trail cameras is the one that's really hung up and got a lot of people, frustrated about this bill. I think there's other things like, why is this process going so fast? Mm-hmm. You heard Representative Snider mention that theoretically by the end of the session, which is coming up here in March, like 3 weeks away, this could be headed to the governor's office. And, that's why I was so adamant about finding out, where do we direct people's attention as far as like making their voice heard? That's what it feels like is missing, right? And that's a lot of arguments is the RAC was created specifically to get public input. And here we are not utilizing it, and you can agree or disagree with Representative Snyder's, reasoning behind why they did that. But certainly that's the challenge, right? Is how do we make our voice heard when this thing's going to be going down the pipe in a matter of weeks?
I think that's what's scary for a lot of people. I read a comment just the other day on Facebook is like, this is a pretty important issue. And it's not necessarily the context of the bill that's the big issue. It's about how it's going through. Like a lot of people are saying the Fish and Game should be making these decisions and not politicians. Because, why are the way we're going to hunt going into the Senate? Like, I don't get that. Why are politicians, he even admitted there's not very many guys on the Hill that hunt and fish. So why are they making the laws for hunting and fishing? And it seems very funny how fast and rushed this is going through. And here's my little bit of a conspiracy theory, if I can throw this out there. And we talked about this. I am very intrigued to know why SFW took such a stance on this bill. Why did Don Pay show up to the hearing? That guy's pretty busy fellow, from what I understand. Here's my conspiracy theory. Tell me if I'm wrong. Don Pay and the SFW, as many great things as they've done, they have also pimped out trophy animals in the state of Utah for years and years and years. Don Pay has a lot of rich friends that buy the auction tags, and that money hopefully goes back into good things, good goes back into the hands of people that are fighting for, our wildlife. Why is this such a big issue for them? Why is this such a big issue that Don Pay had to show up to the hearing? I want to know that. I want to know what play SFW has in all of this. You guys have any thoughts?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a question. We had so many questions that we'd love to ask and stuff, and we can go on for days, but just to kind of go over some of the questions that you both mentioned. The first one, I did a little poll just on Instagram poll. I asked, is this moving too fast without enough public input? And 91% say yes, 9% say no. So to that point, again, more people would like a chance to discuss and have discussion and think it's moving too fast. Another thing we didn't get to bring up is how this may favor or take an advantage away from public land hunters versus private, because if you read the bill entirely, there's a lot of language about that. And I asked if people thought it favored private land, and 70% say yes, 30% say no. Last question is the idea of splitting the bill into different topics. And that's a big one that everyone talks about across the board. And 86% say that the bill should be separated into different topics, and 14% say no. So overwhelmingly, majority overwhelmingly want more public input. They do believe this benefits private landowners more than the public land hunters. And then they would like to see it split into different topics. So you kind of tackle each one at a time.
Yeah, with regards to the SFW conspiracy, I mean, I don't know. It's hard to say. I wouldn't be entirely surprised if there was something more to the story. That's why I really was trying to understand what other conservation groups were contacted, what discussions were had. Is there any concern in the essence that, Mule Deer Foundation is not in opposition based on the email we received from them, but then SFW is in support? Oftentimes they're fairly aligned on things. So why is what's going on there? Backcountry hunters and anglers is historically seems to be more liberal leaning on policy and ideas, and yet they're in opposition based on the current language of the bill. We haven't heard back from RMEF, but certainly all those bring questions. And, again, to Eric's point, the public-private land, we had a pile of questions pertaining to some of that where we could hopefully have gained clarity. We had a lot on trail cams, a lot on baiting, a lot on just the overarching, way that this bill's been written. And we weren't able to get to it. And, I appreciate and respect Representative Snider's time today. And I'm glad that we got what we got out of it. I think we could have done this for 3 hours, and tried to really peel the onion layers back further and further, just again, so more people can see. I'm encouraged by the amount of engagement that I've seen on social media. I think it's awesome. I think there's been some great discussions, right? And I don't think we're here to say that it's not worth some discussion points. I think there's some things in the bill that are valid. I think the challenge that we just have is the way it's currently drafted. And, Eric's brought this up in our conversation the other day, but if you can't support every line of the bill, then you should not support the entirety of the bill is our perspective, because again, it's harder to change. And now Representative Snider mentioned that there's many opportunities to make revisions and amendments and such moving forward, but we don't know what that's going to look like. So again, I definitely would encourage everybody, take your passionate comments that you're leaving on Facebook forums or Instagram posts and craft those into a well thought out, well-written email and fire those off to your representatives. That it absolutely makes a difference. It really does. And there's a pile of politicians that are not proactively seeking information by looking at social media forums, right? But where they see it, where they feel it is when it's coming in their inbox. And I think that's our opportunity to make a change. And here's the reality, over the last few weeks, California had a bill proposed that was going to ban bear hunting in the state of California. That was removed recently after a strong amount of opposition. Montana has a bill currently proposed that would move a percentage of non-resident combo tags over into an outfitter guide pool. That's currently in the process, and there's quite a bit of contention there. This is the time of year when new bills are being introduced. I know there's one in New Mexico about a trapping ban. I mean, the list goes legitimately on and on. Historically, I feel hunters have never been overwhelmingly that engaged with politics because like it sucks. Like, let's be honest, it's terrible. But the folks that are engaged with it are the ones that are winning more often than not, right? Like whether that be your anti-hunting groups, the humane societies of the world, various legislative lobbyists, you name it. These are the people that understand the process. They're in there doing the work. And that's how, like, I feel like we're just behind the 8 ball there. And as much as it sucks to have to listen to, the politics of hunting, the reality is it's going to become more and more prevalent. And it's, I think it's super invaluable that we become more proactive in engaging in these conversations and becoming, more of a voice, and hopefully just trying to help hunting and outdoors activities, continue to be favorable to the majority of folks that are trying to participate in them.
I think that should be like the overall like takeaway from this podcast is, guys, we have a voice and we have to use it. And if we don't, bills like this are going to get slid under the rug. And before we know it, there's going to be laws based off this idea that some politician had. We have to use our voice now before it's too late. Be thoughtful, be respectful, but we will have a list of people that you can send emails to down in the description based on your area where you live in Utah. But let them know your thoughts and opinions. Like Brian said, a lot of these guys aren't on social media. We're seeing it because we're on social media. I'm seeing it everywhere. I'm seeing a lot of opposition to this bill. If that's what if you oppose this bill, let your voice be heard and send a thoughtful, respectful email to the person that is in charge of you or that should stand up for you.
Eric, closing thoughts?
Oh man, like still there's so many things racing on my mind that we could talk about, but yeah, hopefully maybe we can hop on this call, even if it's just us three, to kind of update everybody, or maybe even Casey's welcome back to come on the podcast. But yeah, I agree, guys. If you are unfamiliar with the bill, you need to read it beginning to end. And again, like BMAC said, I feel that if you don't support the entire bill, you should oppose the bill, and that's just my opinion. So read it. Voice your opinion, whether it's on one side or the other. But at the end of the day, like I always say, man, the hunting community is the best community. I love and appreciate everybody in this community, and we need to work together to get through these hard topics. And sometimes they are hard discussions, and sometimes they can bring emotion, but let's work together to figure them out and move forward.
Yeah, if you oppose the bill, certainly make your voice heard. And if you support the bill, like this is your right as a citizen to share your feedback. And I think that's the beautiful thing about the process. Once we have a chance to understand it, is just to be a voice, to get engaged, and to do what we have the ability to do. Again, like I think it's worth mentioning that there's parts of the bill that I think are very valid to have discussions around, and frankly, like they just need to be separated out. The way it's worded now, again, I think is just too broadscaping. Even though like we're not using apples, like we're not baiting personally amongst the group, we don't do that. Have we used like the critolic or some minerals kind of season? Absolutely. Certainly got some trail camera photos, but during the hunting seasons, particularly in Utah, like that just doesn't happen. And so personally, like it wouldn't truthfully impact the way like we are hunting. But again, just as like an overarching way the bill is written, it just doesn't seem like it's the right way to write this bill or handle it.
Yeah, and I would say just through reading public comments, social media, and things like that, this isn't coming from people who are like, I just want to hunt on bait and just trail camera every mountain I hunt. It's most people that oppose it are just like, yeah, like I've kind of used some, a little here, a little there. It hasn't really helped me out. But the people who are opposing it isn't simply because all we want to do is hunt that way. But yeah, again, I can go on and on, man. Like there's still so much to talk about, but we'll wrap this thing up.
Yeah, great conversation, guys.
Yeah, it's a little bit out of our comfort zone. So apologies to anybody that's really dialed in on politics and legislative processes and civics. But at the end of the day, we felt like it was certainly worth the time and energy and investment to try to have this discussion with Representative Snider. Again, we appreciate him for his time. And hopefully you walk out of this with a little bit more insight on, how the bill currently sits, and maybe it changed your perspective, maybe it doesn't, but we appreciate you guys for watching, and we will definitely probably have another follow-up conversation on this topic as the bill continues to progress. So thank you guys so much, and we'll catch you on the next podcast.
See you guys.
Thanks for watching, guys.